Imagine being so desperate for money that you would sell your own newborn children, not to loving families, but to medical schools where their tiny bodies would be carved apart by students learning anatomy. In 1881 Tennessee, one family turned this nightmare into their business, and what they built became so horrifying that history itself tried to forget them. This is the story of how poverty and greed created a monster that fed on innocence, and how the most respected institutions in the South became willing accomplices to unspeakable horror. Before we dive into this story, please hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss more shocking stories like this one tomorrow. Also, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love connecting with viewers from around the world. The first clue that something terrible had been buried came on a humid Tuesday morning in March when Nashville construction workers hit something that wasn't supposed to be there. They were digging the foundation for a new parking garage behind what had once been Vanderbilt Medical School when their excavator struck wood. Then bone. Then more bone than anyone expected to find in what should have been empty soil. The foreman called a halt to construction while archaeologists were brought in to examine what everyone hoped would be a forgotten cemetery from the city's early days. What they found instead defied explanation and challenged everything they thought they knew about Nashville's medical history. Dozens of tiny skeletons, most no bigger than a shoebox, had been hastily buried in rough wooden crates with no markers, no records, and no dignity. The bones belonged to infants, some appearing to be newborns while others seemed to have lived only weeks or months before their small lives ended and their bodies found their way into unmarked graves behind one of the South's most prestigious medical schools. The discovery sent shockwaves through the archaeological team, and within hours, investigators were combing through dusty university archives that had been sealed for over a century. What they uncovered in those forgotten files revealed a systematic operation that had supplied human specimens to medical schools across the South for 3 decades. An operation run by a single family who had turned the selling of infant bodies into their primary source of income. The medical schools of the 1880s operated in a world where human anatomy was essential to medical education, but legal sources of cadavers were nearly impossible to obtain. Most states had strict laws governing the handling of human remains, and families rarely donated their loved ones to science. This created a thriving black market where body snatchers and grave robbers supplied medical schools with fresh specimens for teaching purposes. But even these sources couldn't meet the growing demand as more medical schools opened across the expanding nation. Infant specimens were particularly valuable because their small size made them easier to preserve and transport, while their delicate bone structure and organs provided perfect examples for students learning surgical techniques. A fresh infant specimen could command premium prices, sometimes 10 times what medical schools paid for adult cadavers, creating a powerful financial incentive for anyone willing to enter this horrific trade. The archives revealed correspondence between medical school administrators and suppliers that used coded language to discuss their transactions, referring to infant specimens as teaching materials or anatomical specimens, while carefully avoiding any discussion of how these tiny bodies had been obtained. The paper trail led investigators to one family name that appeared repeatedly in these documents, a name that would soon become synonymous with one of the most disturbing chapters in American medical history. The Hartwell family had built an empire of horror that stretched across 3 states and spanned 3 generations, turning human desperation into medical profit while the most respected institutions in the South looked the other way. Josiah Hartwell wasn't born a monster, but poverty has a way of turning ordinary people into creatures they never imagined they could become. In 1852, he had been just another struggling farmer in rural Tennessee, working land that barely produced enough crops to feed his growing family, while watching his neighbors abandon their farms for opportunities in the expanding cities. His wife Martha bore children with clockwork regularity, and each new mouth to feed pushed the family deeper into debt until the inevitable foreclosure notice arrived on a cold February morning in 1858. The loss of his farm destroyed something fundamental in Josiah's character. transforming him from a hard-working father into a man willing to consider options that would have horrified his former self. While other displaced farmers sought work in factories or moved west seeking new land, Josiah found himself drawn to Nashville's growing medical district, where he discovered an opportunity that most people would never have noticed or considered pursuing. The city's medical schools were desperate for teaching materials, particularly specimens that could demonstrate anatomical structures to students who needed hands-on experience to become competent doctors. Adult cadavers were difficult to obtain legally, but infant specimens were even rarer and commanded prices that made Josiah's eyes widen with desperate calculation. A conversation with a medical school janitor revealed that fresh infant specimens could bring $50 to $100 each, more money than Josiah had seen in months of backbreaking farm work. The seed of his horrific plan took root during Martha's next pregnancy, when Josiah began to see his unborn child not as a blessing but as a potential solution to their financial crisis. He convinced himself that he would be serving medical progress while solving his family's poverty, reasoning that infant mortality was so high in their community that one more death would barely be noticed. Martha, weakened by malnutrition and exhausted from caring for their surviving children, initially resisted his suggestions but gradually succumbed to his arguments as their situation grew more desperate. Their first transaction occurred in the spring of 1859, when Martha gave birth to twin boys who lived only long enough for Josiah to confirm that medical schools would indeed pay premium prices for such specimens. The money from that sale fed his family for 3 months and convinced Josiah that he had discovered a sustainable business model that could lift them out of poverty permanently. Josiah began building relationships with medical school administrators across Tennessee and neighboring states, presenting himself as a reliable supplier of high-quality teaching materials who could provide specimens that other sources couldn't match. He developed a network of contacts who asked no questions about the origins of his products, focusing instead on their freshness and preservation quality. His correspondence with these institutions used carefully coded language, referring to infant specimens as anatomical teaching aids or educational materials, while discussing delivery schedules and payment arrangements. Within 2 years, Josiah had established regular business relationships with medical schools in Nashville, Memphis, Louisville, and Atlanta, creating a distribution network that could handle increased production as his operation expanded. He reinvested his profits in better preservation equipment and transportation methods, treating his horrific trade with the same business acumen that other entrepreneurs applied to legitimate enterprises. Martha's frequent pregnancies became the foundation of their new prosperity, with each birth representing another opportunity for profit rather than another burden on their resources. Josiah convinced her that they were contributing to medical science and helping train doctors who would save other families from the kind of losses they had experienced. But the truth was far more sinister than either of them wanted to acknowledge. By 1863, the Hartwell operation had evolved from desperate improvisation into a carefully orchestrated business that ran with the efficiency of any successful enterprise, except their product was human infants and their customers were medical schools hungry for teaching specimens. Martha had given birth 7 times in 5 years, with each pregnancy timed to meet the academic calendar demands of their institutional clients who needed fresh specimens for anatomy classes beginning each fall and spring semester. Josiah had transformed their modest home into what amounted to a processing facility, installing specialized equipment for preserving specimens and maintaining correspondence with medical schools across 3 states. He kept detailed records of delivery schedules, payment arrangements, and customer preferences, treating the sale of infant bodies with the same methodical approach that other businessmen applied to livestock or agricultural products. His ledger books, discovered decades later, revealed transaction records that read like inventory lists from any commercial enterprise. The financial success of their horrific trade allowed Josiah to expand beyond his own family's production capacity, and he began recruiting other desperate families in rural Tennessee who faced similar circumstances of grinding poverty and limited opportunities. He presented himself as a benefactor offering solutions to families who couldn't afford to feed another mouth, convincing poverty-stricken mothers that their infants would serve a noble purpose in advancing medical knowledge while providing immediate financial relief for their surviving children. His recruitment methods exploited the desperation of families pushed to the breaking point by economic hardship, offering immediate cash payments that represented more money than most rural families saw in an entire year. Josiah developed a network of contacts among midwives and traveling preachers who helped him identify potential suppliers, families so desperate that they would consider options that prosperity could never make comprehensible. The Hartwell Network grew to include dozens of families across Tennessee and northern Alabama, creating a supply chain that could meet the increasing demands of medical schools whose enrollment numbers grew each year. Josiah established coded communication systems and delivery routes that allowed him to coordinate shipments from multiple suppliers while maintaining the secrecy necessary to avoid legal complications or moral scrutiny from authorities who might question his business methods. Medical schools placed orders months in advance, specifying the number of specimens needed for upcoming academic sessions and expressing preferences for particular age ranges or preservation states. Some institutions requested infants under 1 month old because their bone structure provided better examples for students learning surgical techniques, while others preferred specimens that had been preserved using specific chemical processes that enhanced tissue visibility during dissection procedures. The correspondence between Josiah and his medical school customers revealed a shocking level of complicity from respected academic institutions, with professors and administrators discussing human infant specimens using the same casual language they might apply to ordering laboratory equipment or textbooks. Payment arrangements were formalized through written contracts that carefully avoided explicit descriptions of the products being purchased while establishing delivery schedules and quality guarantees. Martha's role in the operation had evolved from reluctant participant to active coordinator, managing correspondence with suppliers and maintaining inventory records while Josiah focused on expanding their customer base and developing new preservation techniques. She had become so accustomed to viewing infants as commercial products that she lost the ability to see them as human beings whose lives had value beyond their market price to medical schools. The Hartwell family's prosperity grew dramatically during this period, allowing them to purchase property and establish themselves as respectable members of their community while carefully concealing the source of their newfound wealth. They attended church regularly and contributed generously to local charities, using their legitimate community standing to deflect any suspicion about their actual business activities. The medical schools that built their anatomy programs on Josiah Hartwell's horrific supply chain weren't passive victims of deception but active participants who knew exactly what they were purchasing and chose to look the other way as long as their educational needs were met. Archived correspondence discovered in university basements reveals a level of institutional complicity that shattered any illusions about the moral integrity of Southern medical education during the 1860s and 1870s. Professor Edmund Blackwood of Nashville Medical College wrote directly to Josiah in 1864, requesting a steady supply of the youngest available specimens for our advanced surgical demonstration classes, with particular emphasis on subjects under 4 weeks of age whose bone structure remains optimal for teaching purposes. His letters discussed infant bodies with the clinical detachment typically reserved for laboratory equipment, specifying delivery dates that coincided with academic calendars and requesting preservation methods that would maintain tissue integrity during extended classroom use. Vanderbilt Medical School's anatomy department placed regular orders through Professor William Hastings, who maintained detailed correspondence with Hartwell regarding specimen quality and delivery schedules. His letters praised the exceptional freshness of Hartwell's products, while requesting specific modifications to preservation techniques that would enhance their educational value. Hastings even provided technical advice on chemical solutions that would maintain anatomical detail while preventing decomposition during shipping and storage. The University of Tennessee Medical Department operated perhaps the most systematic relationship with the Hartwell Network, establishing formal contracts that guaranteed specimen delivery for each academic session while providing advance payment that allowed Josiah to expand his operation and recruit additional suppliers. Dean Marcus Thompson's preserved correspondence reveals that he understood the questionable nature of these transactions, but rationalized them as necessary for providing quality medical education in a region where legal specimen sources were virtually non-existent. Medical schools in Louisville, Atlanta, and Memphis developed similar relationships with Hartwell, creating a regional network of institutions whose anatomy programs depended entirely on his supply of infant specimens. These schools competed for priority access to his products, offering premium payments for first selection rights and exclusive arrangements that guaranteed specimen availability during peak academic periods when student enrollment reached maximum capacity. The institutional records reveal that medical school administrators developed sophisticated justifications for their participation in this trade, arguing that advancing medical knowledge served the greater good even if individual transactions raised moral concerns. They convinced themselves that training competent doctors justified the means by which they obtained teaching materials, creating elaborate ethical frameworks that allowed respected academics to participate in systematic exploitation of human desperation. Professor James Morrison of Georgia Medical College wrote extensively about the educational value of infant specimens in his teaching journals, describing their anatomical features with scientific precision while completely ignoring the circumstances that brought these tiny bodies into his classroom. His detailed notes on dissection techniques and anatomical observations treated human infants as nothing more than particularly useful educational tools whose origins were irrelevant to their academic applications. The financial records of these institutions show that specimen purchases represented significant budget items, with some schools spending more on Hartwell's products than on textbooks or laboratory equipment. This level of investment created institutional incentives to maintain relationships with suppliers regardless of moral concerns, as interrupting the specimen supply would have required complete restructuring of anatomy curricula and teaching methods. Medical school faculty members who expressed concerns about specimen sources were quietly reassigned or encouraged to focus on other aspects of medical education, while administrators who asked too many questions about supply chain ethics found their career advancement opportunities limited. The institutional culture that developed around these practices created powerful incentives for silence and complicity while punishing moral courage or ethical questioning. The correspondence between medical schools and the Hartwell Network reveals coded language systems that allowed institutions to maintain plausible deniability about their knowledge of specimen origins while ensuring continued access to the materials their programs required. When Josiah and Martha Hartwell died within months of each other during the harsh winter of 1873, their eldest daughter Sarah inherited more than just property and savings. She inherited a business empire built on human misery that stretched across 4 states and supplied specimens to nearly every major medical school in the South. At 28 years old, Sarah possessed her father's ruthless business acumen combined with an organizational intelligence that would transform the Hartwell operation from a regional enterprise into something approaching industrial scale. Sarah had grown up watching her parents treat infant bodies as commercial products, and she understood the business better than anyone else in the family because she had been managing correspondence and logistics since her teenage years. While other young women her age focused on marriage and domestic concerns, Sarah had spent her formative years coordinating specimen deliveries and maintaining customer relationships with medical school administrators who valued her efficiency and discretion. Her first innovation was establishing what she called lying in houses in rural communities across Tennessee, Kentucky, and northern Alabama, facilities where desperate pregnant women could give birth in secret with the understanding that their babies would be placed with good Christian families who would provide proper care and education. The women who sought out these services were typically unmarried girls whose pregnancies would bring shame to their families, or married women whose husbands had abandoned them and who lacked resources to raise another child. The lying in houses operated under the cover of charitable organizations dedicated to helping unfortunate women during their most vulnerable moments, but their true purpose was providing Sarah with a steady stream of infants who could be immediately transferred to medical schools without the complications that arose from dealing with grieving mothers or suspicious community members. The women who gave birth in these facilities believed they were making difficult but loving decisions to ensure their children would have better lives than poverty could provide. Sarah's recruitment network expanded to include traveling preachers, midwives, and even some local physicians who directed desperate women to her facilities while receiving compensation for their referrals. She presented herself as a Christian woman dedicated to helping unmarried mothers avoid the social stigma of illegitimate births while ensuring their children would be raised in prosperous households that could provide educational opportunities and moral guidance. The operation reached unprecedented levels of efficiency under Sarah's management, with lying-in houses producing dozens of specimens each month, while maintaining the appearance of legitimate charitable work that earned respect from community leaders who praised her dedication to helping unfortunate women. Her facilities were clean, well-staffed, and provided better medical care during childbirth than most rural women could access through traditional means. Sarah established relationships with medical schools that went far beyond simple supplier arrangements, positioning herself as an essential partner in medical education who understood the specific needs of anatomy programs and could deliver customized specimens that met precise educational requirements. Her correspondence with medical school administrators revealed a level of professional sophistication that impressed academic leaders who came to rely on her expertise and reliability. The expansion into multiple states required sophisticated logistics and communication networks that Sarah managed through a combination of coded telegrams, trusted courier services, and carefully maintained shipping schedules that ensured specimens reached their destinations while maintaining optimal preservation quality. She invested heavily in the latest preservation technologies and transportation methods, treating specimen quality as a matter of professional pride that distinguished her operation from less sophisticated competitors. Medical schools began requesting specific types of specimens for specialized courses, and Sarah developed the capability to meet these demands through careful coordination with her network of lying-in houses and supplier families. Some institutions requested twin specimens for comparative anatomy courses, while others needed specimens with particular medical conditions that could illustrate disease processes or developmental abnormalities. Thomas Mackenzie arrived at Nashville Medical College in the fall of 1878 as an idealistic young man from a farming family in western Tennessee, determined to become a doctor who could bring modern medical knowledge to rural communities that desperately needed qualified physicians. He expected his anatomy classes to be challenging and perhaps disturbing, but nothing had prepared him for the steady stream of infant specimens that appeared in Professor Blackwood's laboratory with suspicious regularity and perfect preservation quality. During his first semester, Thomas noticed that while other medical schools struggled to obtain adequate teaching materials, Nashville Medical College seemed to have an unlimited supply of infant specimens that arrived every few weeks in carefully labeled crates that bore no indication of their origins. His fellow students accepted this abundance without question, grateful for the exceptional learning opportunities that fresh specimens provided. But Thomas found himself increasingly troubled by questions that no one seemed willing to discuss. The infants that appeared in anatomy class were remarkably well preserved and appeared to have died recently, unlike the adult cadavers that typically showed signs of extended storage or advanced decomposition. Thomas began keeping informal notes about the specimens he encountered, documenting their apparent age, preservation state, and any unusual characteristics that might provide clues about their origins or the circumstances of their deaths. His suspicions deepened when he observed that Professor Blackwood seemed to have advanced knowledge of specimen deliveries, adjusting class schedules to accommodate shipments and demonstrating familiarity with suppliers that suggested ongoing business relationships rather than random acquisitions from typical medical sources. The professor's casual references to "our reliable sources" and his detailed knowledge of specimen characteristics implied systematic procurement methods that went far beyond standard medical supply channels. Thomas began investigating the paper trail behind these specimen acquisitions, spending hours in administrative offices examining purchase orders and delivery records that revealed patterns of regular payments to suppliers whose names appeared consistently in medical school accounts. The financial records showed substantial expenditures for anatomical teaching materials from sources that had no obvious connection to hospitals, morgues, or other legitimate medical institutions. His breakthrough came when he discovered correspondence between Professor Blackwood and someone named Sarah Hartwell, letters that discussed specimen deliveries using coded language that barely concealed their true subject matter. The letters referenced educational materials and teaching aids while providing detailed specifications that could only refer to human infants, including preferences for particular age ranges and preservation methods that would maintain anatomical detail during classroom use. Thomas realized that he had stumbled onto evidence of systematic trade in human infants that supplied medical schools across the region with specimens obtained through methods that violated every moral principle he associated with medical education. The scope of the operation became clear as he discovered similar correspondence with other suppliers and medical schools, revealing a network that stretched across multiple states and involved respected academic institutions. His decision to expose this trade required careful planning because he understood that powerful interests would work to protect the medical schools whose reputations depended on maintaining secrecy about their specimen sources. Thomas began copying documents and gathering evidence that could substantiate his allegations while avoiding detection by administrators who would certainly destroy evidence and silence witnesses if they discovered his investigation. The personal risk became apparent when Thomas received anonymous warnings to focus on his studies rather than asking questions about matters that didn't concern him, threats that convinced him he was dealing with people who had significant resources and political connections. His fellow students began avoiding him after word spread that he was asking uncomfortable questions about specimen sources, leaving him isolated within the medical school community. Thomas knew that exposing the Hartwell network would require external allies who possessed the legal authority and moral courage to challenge institutions that enjoyed tremendous respect within Tennessee society, but finding such allies would prove more difficult than documenting the crimes themselves. Thomas Mackenzie arrived at Nashville Medical College in the fall of 1878 as an idealistic young man from a farming family in western Tennessee, determined to become a doctor who could bring modern medical knowledge to rural communities that desperately needed qualified physicians. He expected his anatomy classes to be challenging and perhaps disturbing, but nothing had prepared him for the steady stream of infant specimens that appeared in Professor Blackwood's laboratory with suspicious regularity and perfect preservation quality. During his first semester, Thomas noticed that while other medical schools struggled to obtain adequate teaching materials, Nashville Medical College seemed to have an unlimited supply of infant specimens that arrived every few weeks in carefully labeled crates that bore no indication of their origins. His fellow students accepted this abundance without question, grateful for the exceptional learning opportunities that fresh specimens provided. But Thomas found himself increasingly troubled by questions that no one seemed willing to discuss. The infants that appeared in anatomy class were remarkably well preserved and appeared to have died recently, unlike the adult cadavers that typically showed signs of extended storage or advanced decomposition. Thomas began keeping informal notes about the specimens he encountered, documenting their apparent age, preservation state, and any unusual characteristics that might provide clues about their origins or the circumstances of their deaths. His suspicions deepened when he observed that Professor Blackwood seemed to have advanced knowledge of specimen deliveries, adjusting class schedules to accommodate shipments and demonstrating familiarity with suppliers that suggested ongoing business relationships rather than random acquisitions from typical medical sources. The professor's casual references to "our reliable sources" and his detailed knowledge of specimen characteristics implied systematic procurement methods that went far beyond standard medical supply channels. Thomas began investigating the paper trail behind these specimen acquisitions, spending hours in administrative offices examining purchase orders and delivery records that revealed patterns of regular payments to suppliers whose names appeared consistently in medical school accounts. The financial records showed substantial expenditures for anatomical teaching materials from sources that had no obvious connection to hospitals, morgues, or other legitimate medical institutions. His breakthrough came when he discovered correspondence between Professor Blackwood and someone named Sarah Hartwell, letters that discussed specimen deliveries using coded language that barely concealed their true subject matter. The letters referenced educational materials and teaching aids while providing detailed specifications that could only refer to human infants, including preferences for particular age ranges and preservation methods that would maintain anatomical detail during classroom use. Thomas realized that he had stumbled onto evidence of systematic trade in human infants that supplied medical schools across the region with specimens obtained through methods that violated every moral principle he associated with medical education. The scope of the operation became clear as he discovered similar correspondence with other suppliers and medical schools, revealing a network that stretched across multiple states and involved respected academic institutions. His decision to expose this trade required careful planning because he understood that powerful interests would work to protect the medical schools whose reputations depended on maintaining secrecy about their specimen sources. Thomas began copying documents and gathering evidence that could substantiate his allegations while avoiding detection by administrators who would certainly destroy evidence and silence witnesses if they discovered his investigation. The personal risk became apparent when Thomas received anonymous warnings to focus on his studies rather than asking questions about matters that didn't concern him, threats that convinced him he was dealing with people who had significant resources and political connections. His fellow students began avoiding him after word spread that he was asking uncomfortable questions about specimen sources, leaving him isolated within the medical school community. Thomas knew that exposing the Hartwell network would require external allies who possessed the legal authority and moral courage to challenge institutions that enjoyed tremendous respect within Tennessee society, but finding such allies would prove more difficult than documenting the crimes themselves. The trial that Tennessee promised but never delivered became a masterclass in how powerful institutions protect themselves when their survival depends on burying inconvenient truths that threaten their reputation and financial stability. Prosecutor James Wellington had assembled what he believed was an ironclad case against Sarah Hartwell and several medical school administrators. But the forces arrayed against him possessed resources and connections that transformed the legal system itself into an instrument of cover-up rather than justice. Wellington's first indication of serious trouble came when Judge Harrison Caldwell, who had initially been assigned to oversee the Hartwell case, suddenly recused himself, citing unspecified conflicts of interest that prevented him from providing fair judgment. The replacement judge, Marcus Sterling, had financial connections to Vanderbilt Medical School through his brother's position on their board of trustees, creating exactly the kind of conflict that should have disqualified him but somehow escaped official notice during the selection process. Key pieces of evidence began disappearing from prosecutor files in ways that suggested systematic tampering rather than accidental loss or misplacement. Original correspondence between Sarah Hartwell and medical school administrators vanished from locked storage rooms, while financial records that documented specimen payments were destroyed in a convenient fire that consumed only those portions of the courthouse archives that related to the medical school investigation. Wellington discovered that Sarah Hartwell had spent months before her anticipated arrest building relationships with influential politicians and community leaders who owed their positions to medical school support or had family members employed by institutions that depended on continued specimen supplies. Her network of political protection extended from local sheriff departments to the governor's office, creating multiple layers of interference that made normal law enforcement procedures impossible to execute. The witnesses who had initially agreed to testify about their experiences with lying in houses and specimen transactions began changing their stories or refusing to cooperate with prosecution efforts, often after receiving visits from well-dressed men who offered financial incentives for silence or threatened consequences for continued cooperation with investigators. Several key witnesses left Tennessee entirely, claiming family emergencies that required immediate relocation to distant states. Medical school administrators coordinated their defense strategies through shared legal representation that allowed them to present unified responses to prosecution efforts while ensuring that no individual institution could be held responsible for systematic practices that involved multiple schools. Their lawyers argued that medical education served vital public interests that justified procurement methods that might appear questionable to people who didn't understand the complexities of anatomy instruction. The newspaper editors who had initially supported Wellington's investigation found themselves under pressure from advertisers and community leaders who threatened economic consequences for publications that continued covering the medical school scandal. Several papers that had promised extensive coverage of the trial suddenly discovered other stories that demanded their attention, leaving Wellington without media allies who could help maintain public awareness of the issues at stake. Sarah Hartwell's own behavior during this period suggested someone who possessed detailed knowledge of legal strategies and political maneuvering that went far beyond what a rural businesswoman should have understood. Her attorneys seemed to anticipate prosecution moves before Wellington's team made them, suggesting access to information that could only have come from sources within the legal system itself. The corruption extended to courthouse personnel who controlled access to documents and evidence, with clerks and administrators claiming that files had been misfiled or damaged beyond recovery whenever Wellington requested materials that could strengthen his case. The systematic obstruction made it clear that the entire legal apparatus had been compromised by interests determined to protect the medical establishment from accountability. Wellington realized that he wasn't just fighting a criminal case but challenging an entire network of institutional corruption that possessed more resources and political connections than any individual prosecutor could overcome. The medical school's influence had transformed the legal system into an instrument of protection rather than justice, making conviction impossible regardless of the strength of evidence against the defendants. The systematic erasure of the Hartwell scandal from Tennessee's historical record began before the failed prosecution had even officially ended, as medical schools and their political allies launched a coordinated campaign to ensure that future generations would never learn about the infant trafficking network that had supplied anatomy programs across the South for 3 decades. The cover-up operation proved more sophisticated and thorough than the original crimes, transforming respected academic institutions into active participants in historical revisionism. Prosecutor James Wellington received word in March 1883 that all charges against Sarah Hartwell and the implicated medical school administrators would be quietly dropped due to insufficient evidence and procedural irregularities that made successful prosecution impossible. The official announcement cited concerns about prosecutorial overreach and the need to protect Tennessee's reputation for medical excellence, while carefully avoiding any acknowledgement that crimes had actually occurred or that evidence had been systematically destroyed. Sarah Hartwell's death came just 3 weeks after the charges were dropped, under circumstances that raised questions which no one in authority seemed interested in investigating. She was found dead in her home from what the local physician described as heart failure, despite her relative youth and apparent good health during recent court appearances. Her personal papers and business records disappeared before family members could examine them, leaving no documentary evidence of her 3-decade operation. The medical schools involved in the specimen trade began purging their archives of any materials that might connect them to the Hartwell network, claiming that routine document disposal policies required elimination of correspondence and financial records that were several years old. University librarians reported that entire sections of medical school archives were removed during overnight operations that left no trace of their former contents or any indication of what had been destroyed. Newspaper files from the period mysteriously developed gaps where coverage of the medical school investigation should have appeared, with editors claiming that routine maintenance had required disposal of certain editions while backup copies had been lost due to storage problems or accidental damage. The systematic removal of newspaper coverage made it nearly impossible for future researchers to document the scope of the scandal or the extent of institutional involvement. State legislative records that should have contained discussions of medical education oversight and anatomy procurement regulations were edited or removed entirely, leaving future historians with no official documentation of political responses to the Hartwell revelations. Committee meeting minutes that had referenced the investigation were rewritten to focus on other topics, while transcripts of legislative debates were altered to remove any mention of specimen sourcing concerns. The campaign to erase the Hartwell story extended beyond simple document destruction to include active suppression of oral traditions that might preserve knowledge of the scandal within affected communities. Local officials pressured families who had been involved with lying in houses to avoid discussing their experiences, while community leaders discouraged any public mention of events that might damage Tennessee's reputation for medical education excellence. Medical school administrators worked together to create alternative narratives about their anatomy programs that emphasized their contributions to medical knowledge while completely omitting any reference to questionable specimen sources. New institutional histories were commissioned that praised the visionary leadership of medical education pioneers without mentioning the methods by which they had obtained teaching materials for their programs. The few individuals who attempted to preserve accurate accounts of the Hartwell Network found themselves facing social ostracism and professional consequences that discouraged continued efforts to document the truth. Thomas Mackenzie, the medical student whose investigation had exposed the scandal, left Tennessee permanently after receiving threats that convinced him his safety depended on maintaining silence about his discoveries. University archives that had once contained extensive correspondence between medical schools and specimen suppliers were reorganized in ways that scattered related documents across different collections, making it difficult for future researchers to reconstruct the relationships and financial arrangements that had sustained the infant trafficking network. Archivists reported that certain collections had been damaged by water leaks or pest infestations that required disposal of materials whose content was never properly documented before destruction. The tiny bones discovered behind Vanderbilt Medical School in that Nashville construction site told a story that 19th-century Tennessee had tried desperately to forget, but modern forensic science and DNA analysis provided tools that finally gave voice to victims whose suffering had been buried for over a century. The skeletal remains of dozens of infants became evidence that could no longer be destroyed or hidden, forcing a reckoning with historical crimes that powerful institutions had successfully concealed from previous generations. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the forensic anthropologist who examined the infant remains, confirmed that the bones belonged to children ranging in age from newborns to approximately 6 months old, with evidence suggesting they had died during the late 19th century based on burial methods and artifact analysis. The preservation conditions and burial patterns indicated systematic disposal rather than normal cemetery interment, supporting the theory that these were specimens discarded after serving their purpose in medical school anatomy programs. DNA analysis conducted by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation revealed that the infant remains came from multiple families across 3 states, validating the scope of the Hartwell operation that historical documents had only hinted at before systematic evidence destruction made comprehensive documentation impossible. The genetic diversity of the specimens confirmed that Sarah Hartwell's network had indeed reached far beyond Tennessee into Kentucky, Alabama, and northern Georgia as surviving correspondents had suggested. The forensic evidence provided final confirmation that the medical school's denials of knowledge about specimen sources had been deliberate lies designed to protect institutional reputations rather than genuine ignorance about the origins of their teaching materials. The location of the burial site, the systematic nature of the disposal, and the age range of the specimens matched perfectly with the operational methods described in the few surviving documents that had escaped the comprehensive cover-up efforts of the 1880s. Modern investigation revealed that the Hartwell scandal had contributed directly to eventual passage of the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act and federal regulations requiring proper documentation and consent procedures for medical specimens, though these reforms came decades too late to help the families whose desperation had been exploited by the infant trafficking network. The legal framework that now governs anatomical donations and medical research ethics developed partly in response to historical abuses that included but extended far beyond the Hartwell operation. The discovery forced several major medical schools to acknowledge their institutional history with specimen procurement practices that violated both legal and moral standards of their era, though most institutions limited their statements to general expressions of regret rather than specific admissions of complicity in the infant trafficking network. Vanderbilt Medical School established a memorial fund for infant mortality prevention while carefully avoiding any direct acknowledgement of their role in purchasing specimens from the Hartwell operation. The broader implications of the Hartwell story illuminate how economic desperation can drive families to unthinkable choices, while respected institutions exploit vulnerable populations through willful ignorance that provides plausible deniability for systematic human rights violations. The network succeeded for 3 decades because poverty created a reliable supply of desperate families, while medical schools provided a lucrative market that made trafficking financially sustainable. The historical erasure of the Hartwell scandal demonstrates how powerful institutions can manipulate collective memory to protect their reputations, using their resources and political connections to ensure that inconvenient truths disappear from official records and public consciousness. The systematic destruction of evidence and suppression of witnesses created historical amnesia that allowed medical schools to maintain their respected positions while avoiding accountability for their participation in human trafficking. The infant remains found in Nashville serve as a permanent reminder that progress in medical education came at a human cost that was carefully hidden from the students, patients, and communities who benefited from knowledge gained through exploitation of society's most vulnerable members. These tiny victims represent hundreds of families whose desperation was monetized by entrepreneurs like the Hartwell family and institutional customers who chose profit over principles. The Hartwell story challenges us to remember that behind every medical advance and educational achievement lie human costs that are often invisible to those who benefit from progress, and that our obligation to victims of historical injustice includes ensuring their stories are told truthfully rather than buried beneath institutional pride and historical revisionism. If this story has shocked you as much as it shocked me, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel because tomorrow I'll be sharing another hidden chapter from history that will make you a lot of things. These stories need to be told. These victims deserve to be remembered. And your support helps ensure that the truth survives even when powerful forces try to bury it.